Welcome, folks, to the Author Meets Critics Roundtable at the Midwest Political Science Association meetings. The book that we're going to be talking about is my book. I'm the chair of the panel. My name is Jeff Jenkins from the University of Southern California. And the book is Congress in the Civil Rights Era, 1861 to 1918. And this panel is co-sponsored with Section 43 of the Race, Class, and Ethnicity group. Justin Peck is my co-author on the book, and he's here as well. And we have four critics today, and the four critics are Sarah Binder from George Washington University, Ruth Bloch Rubin from the University of Chicago, Robinson Woodward-Burns from Howard University, and Kimberley Johnson from New York University. Justin and I will introduce the book a little bit. We'll try to take maybe 5 minutes each to introduce the book that is not quite out yet. It was supposed to be out in March. It is now due to be out in early May. And then we'll turn it over to the panelists. And we'll go in the order of the program. And the program is Sarah, Kimberley, Ruth, and Robinson. Once we're all done, Justin and I will probably have a few things to say based upon the comments that we get. And then we'll open it up to anyone who might be watching and listening. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to my co-author, Justin Peck.
Hi, everyone. I want to begin by saying thank you to Sarah, Kim, Ruth, and Robinson for taking the time to read the book and comment on it and appear here today. This version, as Jeff said, is done, but we're at work on a second volume that extends the analysis. So we'll definitely take your comments and criticisms of substance or method seriously as we work to finish that one. So it's useful in that we can actually put this to use in future work. It's not just commenting on a book that's already published. So thanks in advance. So as Jeff explained, I'll spend a few minutes setting out what I take to be a couple of the big thematic points that I hoped we were able to draw out in the book. And then I'll turn it over to him to discuss some of the content in a bit more detail. Obviously, the question of race is so central to American political history and development that it's considered from a variety of different angles and perspectives. We chose to focus on Congress, but this doesn't mean that we think civil rights politics happens only in Congress or in the House and the Senate. They may actually be the last stop for civil rights politics, and that mobilizing, protesting, organizing happens on the state and local level. And for both new civil rights laws and also for the erosion of those laws that are on the books. So it happens also through the courts and beginning in the New Deal through the administrative state. So we chose to focus on Congress because especially during and after the Civil War, so much of the formal legal action on civil rights occurs in the legislative branch, not through the courts or through the executive. More specifically, efforts to define and protect citizenship for freed slaves and their children began in Congress. And the decisions made there were then expected to be enforced, obviously, by officials on the state level. So when Reconstruction gave way to redemption and Jim Crow, action also needed to be taken in Congress. And we want to sort of cover both angles there. And in this case, as Democrats at the state level used fraud, violence, and terror to erode Black rights and endanger Black lives, Democrats in Congress also worked to block further federal efforts to advance civil rights initiatives or to reverse those gains that were won through the 1860s and the 1870s. In particular, we wanted to draw out patterns or tendencies that civil rights politics produces in the United States, starting in the Civil War and with the formal legal end to slavery. The one that I'll mention here, because it's in the title of the book, is to say that civil rights politics in Congress, we believe, coheres into eras. And these eras are defined by kind of progress, stagnation, and reversal. And the way we've defined it here is that what happens in the Civil War and after is the first sort of era, which has that kind of structure to it. And more specifically, we argue that Congress can be motivated to advance civil rights, but usually only in the face of significant, sustained public pressure, oftentimes crisis. And such public pressure tends to culminate and then finally force Congress to act But as soon as the pressure lifts or is met with the stronger force of white supremacy, Congress usually finds itself first unable to continue acting, and soon thereafter becomes a venue for eroding the advances that have already been made. And so progress on civil rights in particular for Black Americans tends not to be, or is very difficult to say, is self-perpetuating in the way that some other reforms are. We also aim for this book to make clear the options Congress chose not to adopt. And we offer in the book a close reading of congressional debates and votes on various bills and amendments, in part because we wanted to highlight what Congress did enact between the Civil War and World War I by drawing out what it might have also done but didn't do for a variety of reasons. And we try to explain why some of those paths were actually not taken, oftentimes due to politics internal to the legislative branch. And we hope that by showing the range of options, some of which were quite radical, I think, and creative, we hope to make clear in each chapter what was on the table, why those things were on the table, and why what was done was actually done. And we hope that after reading, people will be able to judge congressional decision-making, not just based on the finished products, but also based on a comparison to what might have been. And then the last point I'll make is that because this era of American politics is so thoroughly dominated by the Republican Party at the national level, we wanted to make clear how the GOP handled civil rights in the decades before Black voters broke with the Republican Party and moved over into the Democratic Party. Kenesha Grant's recent work on Black migration out of the South helps put into context one big idea that we hope is sort of hinted at here, which is that because of the way our system functions, Black voters were forced to rely for their political support on a partisan coalition that existed outside the South. And civil rights progress mostly hinged, therefore, on the attitudes of Northern white voters and legislators. And Black Southerners found themselves with very few options when Northern public opinion turned. And one thing I hope we make clear is that the staggering sort of insensitivity many Republicans in Congress demonstrated toward the abuse and outright criminality faced by African Americans beginning in the early 1880s and carried forward through World War I. For this reason, we think it's useful to think of the decisions made by reactionary whites on the state level as also aimed at influencing Northern public opinion. And we can't, and we say in the book, right, we can't in any way get at the precise kind of public attitudes because there's no polling, but we treat legislators as a kind of, in the North and Republican Northern legislators as a kind of proxy for what's going on public opinion wise. And so these three big things, the pattern of progress, stagnation, and erosion we got relative to legislative paths not taken, and the way in which civil rights politics between 1861 and 1918 were filtered through the politics of Northern and increasingly Western Republican Party legislators, while Black voters mostly remained locked in place in the South, are, to my mind, the three sort of guiding ideas of the analysis. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, who will do a little bit more on the detail.
Okay, I'll provide a quick substantive breakdown of the book, which is broken into three parts based on subperiods. The first subperiod involves the Civil War years, and here we detail Congress's first real legislative efforts to confront Black civil rights by tracing how the Republican Party's position on slavery evolved over the course of the war, from acceptance where it existed in 1861 to abolition in 1865. The second subperiod involves the Reconstruction years. The first part of this subperiod was a defining period in post-civil rights policy. Initially, President Andrew Johnson attempted to set the conditions by which the South would be integrated back into the Union, which would have afforded white elites in the South an opportunity to reestablish power by forcing freedmen back into subservience. Once Congress was back in session, however, Republicans fought Johnson, and after several veto battles, they successfully took control of Reconstruction and enacted a series of landmark laws, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which gave former slaves citizenship and equal protection laws, a new Freedmen's Bureau Act, which extended the institution's life, the 14th Amendment, which broadened the rights provided under the 1866 Act and stipulated a reduction in congressional representation for any state found denying Black citizens the right to vote, and the first Reconstruction Act, which created 5 military zones in the former Confederacy to govern readmission and allowed freedmen to vote in the establishment of new constitutional conventions. And finally, the Republicans completed their vision of Southern Reconstruction, enacting the 15th Amendment, which eliminated race, color, or previous condition of servitude as restrictions on voting, and the first three enforcement acts, which empowered the federal courts to oversee elections, preserve order at polling places, and enforce voting rights. In the second part of the subperiod, Congress backslid in its efforts to create an inclusive multiracial democracy. These years saw the Panic of 1873 and the resulting economic downturn cost the Republicans majority control of the House in 1874, as Northern public opinion turned against Reconstruction and protecting Black rights. As a result, efforts to pass an ambitious new civil rights bill stalled until an emasculated Civil Rights Act of 1875 was finally enacted. Finally, before the 1876 elections, the Republicans were unable to pass a new enforcement bill to protect voting rights in the South. And those elections in 1876 would not be kind to the GOP. A complete Democratic takeover of the South occurred, and Republicans lost both chambers of Congress. The third subperiod involves the post-Reconstruction years. During the Redemption years, broadly extending from 1877 through 1891, Black citizenship and voting rights came under assault. Republicans nevertheless continued to work to maintain the southern wing of the party and protect African Americans. Their biggest effort came in 1890, when the GOP pushed unsuccessfully for a new federal election bill to protect voting rights in the South. Sponsored by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, this legislation passed in the House but stalled in the Senate when several Western Republicans joined with the Democrats to defeat it. After the failure of the Lodge bill, we enter the Wilderness years, broadly extending from 1891 through 1918. During these 3 decades, Black political participation was limited by small population numbers in the North and widespread disenfranchisement in the South. As a result, Congressional Republicans were largely uninterested in advancing meaningful civil rights legislation. On the whole, this was a period of stalemate. Although the Republicans did not promote Black civil rights, they did not seek to keep the Democrats from using the federal government as a tool to advance white supremacy. Stalemate was, of course, terrible for Black citizens living under Jim Crow, but the conditions were not yet in place for the irrevocable split between Black voters and the GOP that would culminate in the Second Reconstruction. Finally, we conclude by considering the first civil rights era as a whole. We describe how, by the turn of the 20th century, a broad consensus had emerged both in Congress and in the nation that Southern state government should be allowed to exist essentially as a separate nation within the United States. And while the nadir of the first civil rights era was very low, we also note that an exclusive focus on the era's end obscures the significant achievements that were made in the early post-war period. That is, for a time, African Americans' lives in the South improved greatly. The Republican Party operated as a true interregional coalition, and a normal, though fragile, period of two-party politics in the South seemed to have begun. And with that, you have a general sense of what the book is about. I'll now turn it over to the 4 critics. And as I said, we'll go in the order of the program: Sarah, then Kimberley, then Ruth, and then finally Robinson.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much for including me. Before I offer some thoughts on the book, I think I should fess up. I originally thought I was discussing Jeff's other new co-authored book, Republican Party Politics in the American South. You could forgive me for not realizing how many books Jeff and his colleagues have published during the pandemic. So I was very excited, especially excited to learn about this book with Justin Peck. And then to learn that it's not just 1 volume, there's going to be 2. So I'm just slightly overwhelmed. But this is awesome. It is a great book. It is, as you've just got the sense from Justin and Jeff both, a fascinating and very deep dive into the congressional underpinning of the politics of Reconstruction. And as both Justin and Jeff has just mentioned, sort of both the remarkable successes in the immediate wake of the war, but also its untimely demise in the decades that followed. And as Jeff and Justin make plain throughout the book, it's really impossible to separate those legislative politics of racial conservatism in this period from the birth and the growth of the new and pretty factionalized Republican Party. I love the portraits, I love the political cartoons, and I'm all ready for volume 2. So I thought I would just offer a series of observations / questions that I think arise from the argument and the evidence. So I have 4. So first, pertained to this intersection between Congress and American political development. And I think one of the core contributions here of your book is to bring Congress into the study of APD. Katznelson and Lipinski, of course, have noted often the absence of Congress in legislative studies from sort of the cornerstone of APD scholarship. So much so that the people like myself who study institutional evolution of Congress often don't think of themselves as APDers, if that's the thing. So the question I would raise is this: what do we learn by bringing Congress into the study of APD? And from your work in the book, how does bringing Congress into APD reshape or affect our understanding of political development in this particular period? What do we learn about political development here that we probably would not learn without going deep into the legislative politics? And then vice versa. I mean, how does thinking in terms of this period as an epoch of APD change how we understand Congress, legislators, and legislative politics in this particular period? And also then coming from the vantage point of APD, how did that, or did it affect how you dug into, interpreted the congressional history? The second observation is really about party reputations or the party brand in these very early decades of the Republican Party. And you, of course, place appropriate emphasis on factionalism over civil rights within the Republicans over the decades that you study, as well as the competing dimension within the Republicans of economics and economic growth. Of course, as students of the contemporary Congress, we think an awful lot about party reputations and party brand names, and in particular, party members' willingness to allow party leaders to develop, maintain, and protect the party label. And of course, the role of congressional party leaders in coordinating and steering the party's agenda. So of course, this model of sort of engaged and empowered party leaders doesn't really fit the period that you're studying, right? Because we don't have party leaders, we don't really have Senate party leaders for sure until the 1890s. From Steve Smith and Gerald Gamm's work, we now know we have these sort of traces of multi-member steering committees trying to operate on and off the floor within both parties in the Senate in the late 19th century. So what I'm curious about is how Reconstruction era politics within both parties might have shaped the institutional development of the parties, especially the Republicans in the period. Did conflict over civil rights create more pressure for party leaders to emerge? Or is it that those cleavages, radicals, moderates, conservatives, did those cleavages undermine those efforts? And I raise this in part because of the remarkable level of and degree and complication of legislating that you uncover on the Senate floor and on the House floor over this long period, right, as the parties are fracturing over competing approaches and provisions. And I'm always struck by the frequent need to adjourn to coordinate, particularly the Democrats here, but also the Republicans, to coordinate on a strategy, right? It looks like we're legislating in the absence of effective party leaders. So I'm sort of curious about how you might think about the development of these and the maintenance of party labels, particularly in this period with such fractured Republicans. Third observation is about, we'll call it causal inference. And so I'm sort of curious how you approach the challenge of causal inference at this particular intersection of congressional history and APD. I think the place that stands out most to me was in your sort of pretty fascinating point about the emergence of the notion and the practice of legislating separate but equal years before Plessy versus Ferguson. And so I wasn't sure if your argument was that these congressional compromises made more likely the court opinion and outcome, or whether this was a case of two institutions, Congress and the courts, both reacting to similar political undercurrents that made, quote unquote, separate but equal an accepted compromise at the time within both parties, right, even within the Republican Party, right, first engaged by lawmakers and then reaffirmed by judges. So I wouldn't want a fancy research designed to ferret out, right, those potential explanations, but I'm really just curious about the counterfactuals. How do we know that the congressional politics mattered or not to the court's very obvious, infamous decision? Finally, fourth observation is about the economic panic here. And I really enjoyed the discussion of where the intersection occurred and how it occurred between the politics and economics. And in particular, the electoral fallout that you point to from the panic of 1873, and then the implications for Republicans and sort of hastening, it seems, the end of Reconstruction and this first civil rights era. I'm a little curious, what about the Panic of 1893? Of course, that time it was the Democrats who paid the electoral price, and as we know, a pretty big one. But it doesn't seem to have an effect on Republicans in reviving Republican civil rights efforts. So I wondered, is the point that the ship has already sailed, that Republicans are too divided to renew their efforts, even though they now have this sort of rather large realignment coming out of 1896? Or is it that the Republican realignment in 96 make them realize that Republicans can dominate elections without having to win in the South? Which makes me think maybe I just answered my own question. But this is a great book. There's lots more to be plumbed from it and to be thought about it. And I'm looking forward to the second volume. And so I'll stop right there. Excellent.
I think we have Kimberley up next. Thank you, Sarah.
So it's great to kind of sort of see you all. And thank you for giving me the chance to respond to and think about this really incredibly rich volume. I have to say that I previously actually had a author meets critics on the Republican Party in the South book. So I feel like this is just part 2, and I'm sort of waiting to be a part of part 3 to sort of bring everything to a really sort of satisfactory end. So in that light, I think I'm actually seeing this kind of set in this trilogy, if you will. And so part of my thinking hopefully will give justice to this volume in and of itself, but I can't help but be kind of influenced by the previous volume on the Republican Party in the South, because I think, again, this is so incredibly rich. And I think what Jeff and his varied co-authors, Justin and Boris, have done is really kind of bring out this period that I think has been largely flattened, whether if we're thinking about sort of traditional political history, or even if we're thinking about APD, where this era, I think there's been this sort of trepidation within APD to sort of really kind of get into the guts of what happened kind of before, during, and after the Civil War period. And again, I think as Jenkins, as Jeff and Justin have note at the very beginning of their work, the Civil War era, if you will, that kind of long era, both the decade or so preceding it, as well as the end of what you call the first civil rights era, was truly a revolution in United States history, political history. But in many ways, it was also a counter-revolution. And so I think that that is something that I was really deeply taken by, that the book really pushes against this kind of nice, there was the Civil War, and then there was Reconstruction, and then there was redemption, and then, and then sort of not really understanding that there really is deep continuities between all of these different eras, and that you can't understand one without really understanding the prior era. And I think also seeing that something that happened, say, in the 1890s in a very odd kind of way is the result of some sort of political compromise enacted or adopted during the 1850s. And so really understanding that this is a period in and of itself that really truly has to be understood as a kind of more coherent period. In terms of, I guess, APD, I was thinking about a couple of things. First, I was thinking partly what is going on today, obviously, in politics, and particularly thinking about attempts to enact a more vigorous voting rights bill, and seeing some of these same dynamics playing out in terms of the Senate being the stumbling block towards the enactment of something that would actually kind of change the dynamics of state level elections. But I was also thinking about the last administration, in many ways thinking about the resurgence, almost explicit resurgence of white supremacy as a political factor, as a political tool. And so as I was thinking about this book, I was thinking about the ways in which the way in which white supremacy as a political ideology, as an organizing principle, begins to sort of cohere into something in this sort of immediate post-Civil War moment. And then you see this kind of coherence getting sort of played out within the sort of various institutional structures, but particularly I think in Congress. And so I was thinking about geography as well as sectionalism, and the ways in which I think early APD work took geography and sectionalism quite seriously. And I'm thinking about Richard Bensel's work, and that sort of, I think, has sort of fallen to the wayside. And I think one of the great things about having this focus on Congress brings geography and sectionalism back in as really important forces in thinking about how do we think about the development of the American state. I also think about things like durability, right? So there's Oren and Skoranik's, attempt to sort of define, well, what does APD mean? And in many ways, the definition that I sort of kind of come out of is that it's sort of this durability, right? That's a durable change and a durable political change. And so one of the things I think about, or really just thinking about, is what does durability mean? Particularly, what does durability around the issue around racial equality or racial citizenship mean? When we have this move towards racial equality, or at least attempt to sort of create citizenship for the formerly enslaved, that citizenship basically within within 4 or 5 decades essentially falls to the wayside as essentially a dead letter. So the sort of flip side of durability is the fragility, right? And so really thinking about the fragility of Black citizenship, both in sort of its conception and then how it sort of gets played out in Congress over these subsequent decades of the late 19th century. I was also thinking about critical junctures as well as alternative paths. And the sort of part of, I think, everybody who sort of wishes that things had gone differently kept thinking, well, what if there hadn't been, for example, the Panic of 1873? What if, they'd truly known that if they went down this path, really terrible things would happen later? And of course, they didn't know, and we can't tell them. But it makes me also wonder whether or not critical paths or even something, if there were really any other critical paths. And I think that's somewhat pessimistic, but the way that the sort of incredible party discipline that the Democratic Party, particularly the Southern Democratic Party, displays, once they are able to kind of get back into office, compared to the understandable factionalism within the Republican Party, makes me sort of believe that maybe there wasn't really any alternative, that maybe the Republican Party would never have been able to sort of withstand the sort of deep discipline that the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats, were able to maintain. And again, I think this goes back to the issue of geography and sectionalism. Geography in the sense of, as you note, African Americans really having no sort of strong electoral allies outside of no electoral, presence outside of the South. And so therefore, they were wholly dependent on Northern Republicans to sort of persuade the rest of the country to sort of go along with them. I was particularly struck by a quotation that you all pulled out from the Bateman, Katznelson, and Lipinski volume, which I really think that it really just sort of captures what you were trying to do. And essentially, to paraphrase it, Black America's rights and privileges were determined, or were being determined, by Southern whites rather than by the terms of the National Constitution and legislature. And I just thought that really was just like, that's what happened, right? That we have this kind of moment, very much contested during this sort of height of the sort of Civil War and the sort of first era, the first Reconstruction era, in which this sort of the terms of national inclusion, of national citizenship were set down. And there's a great example where one of the Republican legislators liken it to having the people in charge of regulating themselves who are in turn unable to regulate, committing crimes and giving them the power to self-regulate. And this is the discussion of antitrust, but it was just a little of a side, but I thought, that's what's happened, right? That they essentially decide that the very people who are engaged in stripping away citizenship would be given the right to determine citizenship. And again, I think as you very rightly note, that it is this factionalism within the Republican Party that enables this. Again, I think this is part of, the tragedy of the era is how shallow Northern white opinion was in terms of supporting political as well as even social equality for African Americans and the formerly enslaved. And so I think that even as there are sort of fewer and fewer good guys, and I would have loved to hear more about their thinking, there's this kind of sense that, again, the sort of support among Northern public opinion, white public opinion for equality was just very shallow and quite fragile, and in fact fleeting. And so the Republican factionalism basically is unable to doesn't even get any sustenance from public opinion. Rather, it sort of reflects this kind of fleeting public opinion. So there's a lot to say. I mean, I think I would say that the political cartoons were amazing, but I think what really I would have loved to hear more from, and that it's not that kind of book, would be the folks who kind of kept at it, the Republican members of Congress who kept bringing up these bills, even though actually didn't really do them any electoral good. Yet they sort of continued to sort of push forward, even during the sort of wilderness years, although certainly by then, many of those folks who were sort of in favor of Black civil rights were, they either died or had left office by then. But, it would have been interesting, what keeps that sort of flame alive among those folks, particularly I think at a moment like this where we're seeing lots of different ideas about where the country should go forward. I think it's always an interesting story for us to know what is it about those who are pushing for equality that kind of keeps them going, even in the face of some stiff headwinds against them. So I'm going to leave it at that. There's more I'd say, but I thank you again for letting me have a chance to respond to the book.
All right. Thanks, Kimberly. And we have Ruth up next.
Thanks, Jeff and Justin. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and I must say my standards for what a good pandemic read have gone down over time, but this certainly cleared the bar by large measure. And that's not an easy thing to do, I think. I suppose I'm in a group of people for whom reading about Reconstruction is something one does on the side. And so this one was really a pleasure to read, just the sort of the craft of the narrative, as well as the terrain that was covered. And it's not an easy thing to do, to write enjoyable political history and certainly legislative history. So as someone who endeavors to do that, I appreciated that in particular. I want to note that I think, like in many ways, Justin and Jeff's book tells a story that readers of Reconstruction era politics will be familiar with. In particular, the idea that both radical and moderate Republicans in Congress passed civil rights legislation to make it possible for formerly enslaved Blacks to vote Republican, even in the face of white violence. We know that story. But the sort of electoral connection taking sort of a prominent place, the idea that when Black voting power in the former Confederacy started to decline, and moderate Republicans became increasingly uncomfortable with the scope of federal interventions in the South, that impetus pushed or sort of their discomfort led them to push Congress to abandon the reform movement. And this is certainly a story that is echoed in other accounts. And so it was somewhat comforting in such a comprehensive analysis to see it here as well. And I think in particular, one of the things that, and others, both Sarah and Kimberly mentioned this, the story of factional politics is particularly interesting, and I think more innovative than a lot of other Reconstruction accounts, which tend to highlight other factors as being really critical determinants of the path to Southern redemption. I also want to commend the authors for putting Congress at the center of the story. Admittedly, this is somewhat self-serving, but I do think that Congress as an institution is a really interesting place to see these democratic politics play out. And I think there are competing narratives within political science and legal academia in particular about which institutions are more likely to be sort of defenders of minority rights or majority rights. And I think you guys do a really great job of painting a nuanced portrait, which, like I think many good academic answers is, sometimes Congress does a really good job of starting to deepen and enhance or democratize, and at other times it turns on its heels and does quite the opposite. And so generalizing about institutions at any given level is really difficult and something we should be very careful in doing at all. I also want to talk a little bit or frame the rest of my comments in focusing particularly on sort of the politics of congressional Republicans. I think of this as sort of like, I guess my, relatively speaking, comparative advantage as someone who's really interested in factional politics. This is part of the story that I found most innovative and again, really well illustrated in the different legislative histories that you guys offer. So I wanted, rather than go on at length about all of the myriad of questions that one could raise, is to really focus on 4 core questions that I think are interesting, not only given your work, but actually sort of help us to reflect about where the discipline or this particular group of scholars who are interested in these issues should go in thinking about future work. And so the first question is both an empirical one, but also a theoretical one. And so that's like thinking a little bit about why it was that Democrats were better able to hang together than competing factions within the Republican Party, and what this can tell us about sources of party cohesion and party fracture more broadly. I think these are this sort of sense of what keeps a party together, even when there are presumably some underlying divisions, and when that party ultimately fractures or turns on its own accepted policy regime, are compelling today. And Reconstruction seems like a nice opportunity to think about that. The second question is one that is related, which is to be thinking about what it means to have a party at all. So I really liked the idea of calling the Congressional Republican Party, as well as the party at large, an umbrella coalition. As they write, it's an umbrella coalition for abolitionists, Northern Whigs, and Free Soilers. You could think of this as like a holding company. And given all of the literature among congressional scholars about what a party is, whether it is a cartel, whether it is sort of a vehicle for collective action in other respects, or whether it's really rooted in electoral politics, I think this is a sort of opportunity to think about whether we can push or think about parties in Congress from a variety of different vantages. I also think from an APD perspective, it's interesting to think about whether the Republican Party at this time was always a marriage of convenience and thus doomed from the outset, or whether that more contingent politics led to its unraveling. And then I think from this, one might wonder what this tells us about whether factions are sort of inherent that bubble up from electoral politics, or whether how they are manifested in parties in Congress has to do with what's happening within the legislative branch itself. And so I obviously these are questions I'm interested, but I think are raised by this historical account, if not overtly. I also think this same sort of question about focusing on factionalism offers some opportunities to think about path dependence and the stickiness of identities and institutions. So it's interesting that the divisions that originated in the 1840s and 1850s lasted through the 1890s and 1900s. And so I'm curious what Jeff and Justin think about why that is. I'd also note, sort of as a third question, given their account, and this is something, again, I've thought some about, but I don't have any great answers, is how the authors would think about how one should define or identify a faction, and what the Reconstruction era teaches us about how to do this in a general way. And so I found their discussion of that really interesting, and I would love to hear them expand a little bit about that. And within that, in particular, curious what that teaches us about contingency. In particular, was the retreat from civil rights, which sort of followed Northern public opinion, inevitable, or is there something else to the factional politics that we can learn? And then finally, I have a sort of methodological or perhaps mechanical craft question. As Justin noted at the beginning in his sort of opening remarks, one of the core features of the narrative is to rely on eras as a mechanism to organize history. I would note that in some ways this is kind of a subtly controversial move. Not everyone loves periodization schemes. And so for those of us who are engaged in doing political history, reading congressional history, I'd be interested in hearing what Jeff and Justin think about the virtues and vices about thinking about political development in this way. Is this really mostly a narrative tool, or is there analytic value as well? So I realize I've thrown a lot at you and it can be hard to digest. So I'm going to leave it there. And I look forward to hearing Robinson wrap this up.
And over to Robinson.
Thanks. Well, thanks again to the authors for having me and to the other panelists for those excellent comments. This book was a pleasure to read. It's an extraordinarily comprehensive survey of congressional civil rights bills and acts from the start of the Civil War to the end of the First World War. And so I'll offer brief thoughts on the book, and I'll do that with an eye towards my own background of American constitutional development, trying to emphasize what the authors do nicely, which is point out the ways in which Congress can be an interpreter of the Constitution, and also how constitutional debates can fracture congressional coalitions. So I'll start with a little bit about the theory, and I think two things the authors do nicely are sort of coalitions and counterfactuals. I think that'd be sort of a good tag for the second book, maybe. The book nicely points out divisions within parties, between parties, but especially within parties, given Republican hegemony or near hegemony in the 1860s and 70s, which gradually wanes, and then we see an emphasis on inter-party splits. And then the work also, as the authors point out, emphasizes these counterfactuals, or really sort of alternate paths. They're not exactly counterfactuals, and there's not an attempt to sort of build out a theory of counterfactuals to develop causal claims the way, say, some comparativists might. I think that's probably a wise choice, given that is sort of methodologically hairy. So I think the authors are wise to simply sort of call this emphasis on alternatives. So what else does the theory do? One thing I really appreciated was that it takes seriously how disputes in interpreting the Constitution and constitutional powers of Congress act as a constraint on the formation of party coalitions. So we think about parties, to some degree, there's still this sort of ascendant assumption that parties are functional, that they serve the needs of their members, that coalitions form for a reason, to aid in the re-election incentive. And one thing that the book does is it shows the role of institutions, specifically the Constitution, in constraining this behavior, creating internal fractures that can impede re-election. The work points out the ways in which constitutional rules are exogenous to Congress, because of extraordinarily high amendment barriers. These are non-negotiable rules, and these rules over enforcement or non-enforcement of constitutional provisions, or the formation of constitutional provisions, provides a strong constraint on development of factions in Congress. So one thing the work does is in the very beginning, it nicely points out the ways in which an extra textual constitutional rule, the rule of bisectional admission of free and slave states in the 1850s, proves to be unworkable because the parties have different assumptions about what will happen to states in the West once they're admitted. And this, even though this is not a formally enshrined constitutional rule, it is an operating one, one that constrains the development of parties, ones that force the Cotton Whigs into the Democratic Party, one that leads to the decimation of the Northern Democrats in the 1856 elections. And that's a story with which the book begins, and one that I think it tells regularly throughout. It also, though, really shows this working within the GOP in the 1860s and 70s and on, and I really enjoyed that. It also, though, it doesn't only take the Constitution as a constraint on congressional behavior, but also shows the ways that Congress has agency over the Constitution, not only through its amendment powers, which were invoked in this era in a way they never really would be again. While Congress passes later amendments, none have the scope of, say, the 14th or the omnibus nature of the 14th. It also, though, shows how Congress was an active interpreter of the Constitution. After these amendments were passed, members of Congress debated exactly what the congressional enforcement provisions, these novel sections 2 in the 13th and 15th and section 5 in the 14th, actually meant. And so there's an era, a story in this era about how Congress doesn't usurp from the Supreme Court, but in cooperation with the court sort of understands exactly what is acceptable in terms of congressional enforcement. And I'll sort of talk about that. I think the book does that nicely with especially with the Interstate Commerce Act towards the end. I was really impressed by just sort of the comprehensiveness of this. It really does summarize all of the different eras, all of the different bills in the era. And for me, that's nice just to have this encyclopedic reference, if nothing else, so that, if I forget what the Third Enforcement Act did, I can just flip back to that. So I really appreciate that. That'll be helpful to me down the line. But what I'll try to do is sort of just, instead of giving a blow-by-blow summary of the thing, I'm just going to look at 3 of the eras: the abolition and early Reconstruction, the late Reconstruction, and redemption periods, to try to show how the book does these things nicely and hopefully give some suggestions for the next book rather than sort of critique, since the thing's in print already. So in terms of showing how coalitions form and fracture over constitutional rules, I think the book does a very good job showing just how divisive the Corwin Amendment was. I put together a database of all proposed constitutional amendments, and in 1860 and 1861, Congress is scrambling to find a constitutional solution. They proposed, I think, 300 amendments or so in about the 12-month period centered on the secession winter, when they'd proposed only about 200 in the entire history before that. The Corwin Amendment emerges as this imperfect solution, one that yields initial sort of splits and then eventually a ascendant and a hegemonic GOP with the expulsion of southern states. But I think the thing the book does nicely is it also shows how this is sort of an artificial homogenization within the party. There's great division about the 10% plan that Lincoln has versus the Wade-Davis bill. This is something I wrote on in my own book, and I wish that I'd had your book before, because this was really informative and I really appreciated getting that sort of blow by blow of the division between Lincoln and the Wade-Davis bill, and then Lincoln's famous pocket veto. I think there was also sort of a mischance in looking at splits over the 13th Amendment, because you see a lot of the same intra-party divisions between the sort of moderate or the Unionist Democrats. So think about Lazarus Powell and Garrett Davis of Kentucky, who understand the 13th Amendment as requiring compensated emancipation. The 13th Amendment is entirely different from emancipation in conquered southern states, in that they're really sort of outside of normal civil law. They're operating under martial law at this period. And the 13th Amendment creates this entirely novel extension of power into peaceful southern states and interference of property rights in peaceful southern states that Lincoln, as the book points out, really was sort of uncomfortable with. And so you get the very conservative wing, Garrett Davis and Lazarus Powell on one hand, versus Sumner, who proposes a 13th Amendment that included an equal protection clause and equality of rights. On the floor, I think it's Lazarus Powell, charges Sumner with radicalism, and Sumner replies, "Well, this can't be a radical clause. I took it from the French Constitution of the French Revolution," and he sort of gets laughed off the floor for that. And what emerges is Trumbull's proposal, which is familiar. It's in the Northwest Ordinance, the old state constitutions of the Northwest, and it gets through because it's brief. people agree on it, and it sort of bridges these inter-party divisions because it's so brief. It's already entrenched in most of the Southern state constitutions, the Reconstruction constitutions by 1865. But it's that familiarity, and brevity that make it palatable. And so, to sort of make this digression on the 13th Amendment useful, going forward, with the next book, there's also the story of amendment politics, which is really central to the Reconstruction, is not so central to the second Reconstruction. The 23rd Amendment might be a civil rights amendment, might not be. The 24th, repealing the poll tax, the 26th, lowering the voting age to 18, might also be. But what's interesting is that those amendments look a lot more like the 13th Amendment in that they're really narrowly constrained. They're very short amendments with sort of a narrow conception of what congressional power is. And they don't look very much like the 14th Amendment, which emerges as this huge omnibus bill in the ways that I think the authors very nicely show. And so there's, one of the questions I had is why does the 13th and the 15th Amendments, they pass because they're short, because they're consensuses between they're a consensus amendment between different wings of the party. The 14th Amendment passes also as a consensus, but an omnibus consensus. Why in the second Reconstruction, for one, do we see sort of a dodging of constitutionalizing the major issues of the second Reconstruction? And two, when we see constitutionalization, why does it look like the 13th and 15th Amendments, sort of short, brief consensus amendments, rather than the 14th Amendment, which is really an omnibus proposal that originally, Thaddeus Stevens stitched together from half a dozen different proposals. So that's sort of one thing that I'd be curious about the second book is just strategies of constitutionalization, compromise through brevity in the second Reconstruction, looking more like the 13th and 15th and less like the omnibus 14th Amendments. So sort of two brief thoughts on late Reconstruction, then one on redemption, and I'll wrap up. I think the book does a really nice job sort of laying out how the late Reconstruction era works. I think the late Reconstruction era, because it's one of congressional ascendance, you get Congress writing these huge, omnibus 14th Amendment, their Military Reconstruction Acts, capacious sort of bills. And so I'd just sort of like to hear more about how congressional ascendance yielded these longer acts or bills. I think in terms of sort of alternate paths or one of the work nicely highlights these alternate paths. One that I particularly appreciated was the original phrasing of the 14th Amendment, Section 2, which creates this explicit trip provision where once you pass that 2/5 disenfranchisement level, you have to enforce the act. This is something that the language never makes it in. The Section 2, despite those debates in the 1910s, never gets enforced. And so you have something that would have worked like the VRA's Section 4 and 5, having that clear line, which would have authorized congressional enforcement much more easily. It gets taken out. And so this is a clear story about paths not taken and how that change in language really sort of takes away congressional power to enforce, or better allows congressional factions to shirk enforcement. On the redemption era, again, there's sort of this really great story about alternate sort of paths through the Blair Education Bill, which I appreciated. I like the stuff on the O'Hara's bill and how it affected the interstate, Congress's own understanding of its interstate commerce powers. It highlighted this story in which Congress does have these explicit powers over the federal district, over highways and places for storing munitions, over the military. And this is something that you see Congress invoking in the 1940s, late 40s, 50s, and then into the 60s. I hadn't really known that they were considering using this kind of language in the 1870s and 80s. It makes sense given the fight over abolition was long the fight over abolition in the District of Columbia or in the federal territories. And there's sort of this continuity the authors highlight between that free soil, strict construction reading of the Constitution and congressional powers into the civil rights era in O'Hara's bill that I really enjoyed. So concluding thoughts, sort of one small thing, which I'd just be curious, this is more fodder for discussion, but it didn't come up in the book, so I'd be curious to hear what the authors think. In 1889 to 1890, the Republicans stacked the Senate by creating 6 new states, They split the Dakotas to create North and South Dakota, largely against the wishes of Dakotans themselves. And then they had Washington and Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, states that are still essentially unoccupied territory. And they get immediately 12 senators, and they start rolling Democrats. They have almost uninterrupted Senate control. And my question is, why, if they lock the chamber successfully until the New Deal, why don't they leverage that into to further roll the Democrats by expanding the black vote in the South? That is to say, why don't they use that power to keep playing hardball and rolling the Democrats by further expanding the franchise? That's sort of a counterfactual I'd be curious to indulge. And then one final thought on the next book. One thing I'd be curious about is the interaction of social movements. So this is a book that narrowly sticks to civil rights, and that's, I think, an important thing to do, in that it's an extraordinarily capacious book already. It passes 300 pages. There are movements that intersect with abolition and the expansion of civil rights, prohibition, female suffrage. These are all the same people fighting the same fights, also with their own internal divisions. So Blair, for example, was an early and ardent prohibitionist. And I'd just be curious, and this may be something more for the second book, about how the interaction of social movements affects the formation of coalitions, since after all, a lot of the people who were advocating for civil rights also saw this as intersecting with female suffrage or prohibition to some degree. Overall, though, this was an absolute pleasure to read. It's an extraordinarily thorough book. It's one that's sort of shaped and improved my own thought. And so I really appreciated it, and I appreciate the chance to be here. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, everyone. I guess maybe Justin and I will take a little time to respond if we have any thoughts. And Justin, did you want to go first? Are there things you want to talk about?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So thank you to everybody. There's a lot, and I'm not going to go through point by point. Instead, I'm just going to draw on the things that people said that, I found myself most compelled by as I was writing the book and doing the research. And so the first one of those things, the intersection of, I guess, factionalism and Kimberly's point about geography. I think my attitude, or my sense coming out of the book, is just how important the fact that Black voters and citizens are reliant on Northerners for civil rights. I don't think I fully appreciated the way that geography actually works to both create the factionalism that we've described, and that there are Northern public opinion on civil rights questions here is complicated, and that it is the discontinuities or differences in the willingness of different places in the North to think about these and how they receive and think about the laws that are being debated is the ball game here, it seems. And one thing that I think part of the alternate paths, or the paths not taken story, to my mind, that is clarified, or was clarified as we were doing this, is just how concerned Northern legislators were that laws that were written for civil rights purposes not be enforceable in the North. And that the concern is always, if we do this, will this impact Northern voters and Northern citizens? And if it will, in some kind of meaningful way, then those are the types of provisions that are usually the first to go. And so what makes enactment of so much of this possible is the ways it is tailored to deal specifically to the South. And I think about this too in doing the research for the next one. And you think about civil rights and King in Chicago, or places where the civil rights movement in the later Reconstruction fails in Northern cities. To me, is one of these still, you see Northern public opinion is fine imposing civil rights policy on Southerners, but as soon as things start to drift north, opinion turns. And so I do think that the geographical consideration here is very important, and that's why I think, like Kenesha Grant's book and others on the all of this hinges on the ability of Black people to leave the South and the ability to move. And so in that sense, I think movement and geography are central to the story, and that because Northern public opinion, like you said, is so, it's shallow, but it's also of the attitude that we'll do this for them, but we're not going to impose these same rules and constraints on ourselves. And so I think that there's a lot there about Northern opinion and liberal and moderate opinion on civil rights being deeply, on the one hand, they're the advocates. On the other hand, it's, it's sort of it's complicated by the fact that they're oftentimes unwilling to impose these rules on themselves. So I think that the efforts then to get to Sarah's point about the congressional organ, I also, the way to deal with factionalization, I also found myself interested as we were doing the research on the constant impulse to resort to committees, the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, oftentimes the need to construct conference committees to iron, like that becomes the mechanism by which a lot of these things are dealt with. And so not knowing offhand my congressional institutional development, well enough, perhaps. I don't know if that is specific to this or not. You maybe can tell me, but I think that it is interesting that is oftentimes how this stuff gets done is they go into some committee, which is comprised of some version of the spectrum of Republican opinion. And then we leave it to them to hash something out. And then we can, come back and work through our problems. So that's what I'll say on that point. And then the last point I'll just make is on Ruth's question or point about periodization, in part because I love reading APD method and theory. And so I appreciate that some people are not particularly thrilled. And I think there are obviously problems with periodization. I think that in particular, the story of Black civil rights in the United States is one that I think is particularly amenable to periodization, because I do think that the way in which lawmaking on this particular issue works is so clearly one of the sort of building momentum, a crisis, enactment, and then almost immediately effort erode or reverse. And so I don't think lawmaking on this issue in particular, because it follows that pattern, I think works for a periodization. I don't know that I would say that would hold over the entire spectrum of public policymaking in the United States. But I think on this area in particular, I do think that it is a useful way to think about long American political development over the long term. And so I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's all I'll say in response for now.
Okay, let me say a few things, and probably by saying a few things, that'll lead me to say more things in a little bit. But just a short history of this book, right? And this goes a little bit to the periodization point. So this book started as a book that was going to be published by Princeton University Press. And we had written a prospectus that was going to document 150 years of civil rights history in Congress. I think we even talk a little bit about this in the preface of the book. And as we started to write some of these conference papers that would tackle parts of what we wanted to do, we recognized this was going to be like a Dan Carpenter size book at the end of the day, right? Which neither of us, for a variety of pragmatic and health-related questions, wanted to tackle at that point. So we began to think about a little bit about what we had on paper at that point and what we had yet to write. And it looked pretty much like there were two arcs. The arc that we were writing and finishing up, and this other arc that we were imagining would take place in the second part of this massive book, or better yet, a second book. So Princeton wasn't going to let us actually do two books, right? They wanted one book. And their advice would be to kind of strip out the history, right? And that's kind of like, well, it's kind of that's the thing here, right? Shorten it. So they gave us discretion to talk with other publishers, and we talked with Chuck Myers at Chicago, and we ran this idea, this sort of two critical arcs idea by him, and he asked for two prospectuses, two proposals, right, that would go through both of these books and what they would look like. So we had to essentially convince him that this story actually had merit, and it forced us to sit down and actually kind of more comprehensively put this down on paper. So while I think the periodization makes sense, it has an interesting backstory a little bit, right? So everybody mentions, pretty much as I'm looking at the comments that were jotted down, everybody mentions factionalism, right? I mean, I think that certainly comes out of the book. And it's gotten me thinking a little bit about what the Republican Party was. And when I think about what the Republican Party was, I think about what the Whig Party was, right? And we tend to think of these second major parties as best responses to the Democrats. The Democrats seem to be the party of cohesion. I think Aldrich talks about that in his book, right? Despite the fact that the Democrats had this northern-southern split throughout much of the 19th century, the Democratic Party as a cohesive interregional party is able to withstand those things in the way that the Whigs were not. And then you begin to think about, what were the Republicans as the Republican Party begins to form in the 1850s? Well, some of them were former Whigs, right, from the North. Some of them were former Free Soilers. Some of them were former Liberty Party members, right? It was an umbrella coalition, as Ruth mentions, right? I mean, there was a lot of different parts tangentially around the slavery issue, right? You had some abolitionists who cared deeply about slavery as a moral issue. You had the Free Soilers who simply didn't want African Americans in the North to compete with white farmers. You had a lot of the Whigs who could kind of go back and forth in the degree to which they, thought it was moral, thought it was economic. So you had this group of people thrown together around this topic that was pretty important until it wasn't anymore, right? Until we see the South secede, until we have a civil war. And then the issue of slavery itself and opposing extension of slavery isn't there anymore. Then we have to think about, what are the Republicans going to do on all of these issues? How are they going to put the Union back together? And a lot of them wanted to go in different directions, right? I mean, I think in my mind, the late 19th century is maybe the most interesting 50-year period in American history in the way that the country is changing. It's a period I like a lot. It's a period I like to learn more about. But I'm not sure anybody's really ever done a coherent, cohesive study of the Republican Party as a factional group over time. I think that would be kind of interesting to do. You could potentially track each individual member and see how they kind of emerged over time. I remember, is in the vast wasteland of papers that I wanted to write but never did. One of those papers was going to look at maybe I still will, who knows? One of those papers was going to look at the Unionists during the Civil War in the border states and see which direction they actually went right after the war. A lot of them became Republicans, but a lot of them went back to the Democratic Party. And, Martis calls these people conditional and unconditional unionists, right? They had different versions of what unionism meant in their minds. Some of them became ardent members of the Republican Party. I'm blanking on the guy from Maryland who was important. I'm blanking on his name. Somebody could probably tell me. But that would certainly be a really interesting book. I'll just jump on a tangent because it's fun to do. But as I think about what I'm going to do in the next 10 years in terms of writing, and I've thought a little bit about this, what I want to write. I think if I have my druthers and I have the ability to kind of make all the decisions myself, I'm probably going to stay in the 19th century and write a couple of books. And one of the couple of books that I want to write, one would be a book that essentially does the same thing that you just read, kind of a analytic history of Congress. But instead of looking at African-American rights, I would look at Native American rights and how Native American rights have been dealt with in Congress over time. That's one thing. And as I was thinking about parts of this book that I had written already and some of the comments that I gotten from you today. It is interesting to think about how the Republicans were thinking about the former slaves in the South, and thinking about how those individuals should be protected during the 1860s and 1870s during Reconstruction, and how they can be brought into the Republican Party. And this goes a little bit to Sarah's point about the book with Boris, and how one very pragmatic element within the Republicans, as they're looking at the South in the 1860s, is, hey, wait a minute. Not only can we figure out some way to protect the former enslaved in this region, but maybe these southern states could actually become Republican states, right? Maybe we could actually get some Republican votes from this region. At the same time they're thinking about that, they're thinking about strategies to either assimilate or eradicate Native Americans in the West, right? They're thinking about strategies to push west, and they're not thinking about ways to respect the treaties that they've made to this point. They're thinking about ways that they can essentially rip those treaties to shreds and take those lands by force. And there are, two ways to do it. They could figure out some way to assimilate the Native Americans in a somewhat peaceful way, or they could just wipe them out. And you had somebody like O. Howard, right, who was the first leader of the Freedmen's Bureau, right, essentially being a radical on Native American rights, essentially being someone who was forceful and vociferous in terms of the need to wipe them out. So it's a really interesting period. And it's an interesting period from my perspective in a lot of different ways. So the second book I would write, right, and related to this Native Americans book would be essentially how did we, this would kind of be a little bit like Paul Freimer's book, right? How did we actually settle the West? How did we deal with public lands in the West? There's a really interesting antebellum story about public land development that I think needs to be told in greater detail. And this then becomes a different story after the Homestead Act, right? And how we begin to really move westward in the latter part of the 19th century. So I've really gone pretty far on my tangent, right? But I will simply say that this, the 19th century is a really interesting period. And I think we scratched the surface in this book, and I kind of scratched the surface in the other book with Boris, in one respect, but there are lots of different respects. Anybody want to say anything in response as I look through some of the other comments? Or does Justin have any other thoughts that he wants to talk about?
I'd be happy to just throw it open.
Okay. One of the things that I going to one of Robinson's points is, I think few people really understand that in early 1861, the Republican Party was firmly behind the idea of a constitutional amendment to protect slavery where it existed. Right? They were, if that could have held the Union together, if that could have prevented secession and a civil war, the Republicans were firmly behind that. And Abraham Lincoln, before he, as he was president-elect and before he took office, was a proponent of that as well. So when you think about, and Justin and I talked a little bit about this as we were writing the book, how much do we have to actually talk about the Civil War? Can we just start in 1865 with this book? And I think it really required us to think about how the Republican philosophy and maybe pragmatic belief about slavery and African-American rights actually came together during the Civil War, and how it was driven. And we kind of know this, I think, as political scientists and historians, that Abraham Lincoln was important, but he was always very conservative and careful, and it was really Congress that was pushing him at every step of the way. Right? Congress was doing things to get his goat a lot of times, was pushing too far for his comfort many times. And it really becomes a case of Lincoln being brought along to the notion that his original belief of keeping the Union together was part and parcel of eradicating slavery. That you could not do one without the other. You could not put the genie back in the bottle by 1862 or 1863. You could still talk about things like emancipated or compensated emancipation, right? You could still try to meet with the border state representatives and make sure they stayed in the Union, and maybe do something to hasten their acceptance of some of the things that the radicals in Congress wanted to do. But, by that point in time, the eradication of slavery was, it was a critical mission. I'm going to write a Broad Street. So you guys probably know about Broad Street, right? This blog that I do now. I think the Broad Street post that I'm going to write for Friday is going to look back on some of the work that I did in my dissertation 20 years ago. And when I was doing several essays on the Confederate Congress. And the first two essays, which most people know because, or much better known because they both got into the HAPS, were ways to kind of get leverage on important theoretical questions in today's literature on the Congress, right? Parties and ideological voting in Congress. But the third essay, which was one that I had the most fun writing, that has been mostly ignored, was essentially what were the consequences of, or first, why didn't the Confederacy have parties? And what were the consequences of not having parties in the Confederacy? And that third essay was an APD essay that eventually got into an exchange with Richard Bensel in studies. And one of the first things that you do, or that you could do, is take a look at what the Confederate founders wrote in their Constitution. They took the US Constitution and they just kind of did a little editing on it. And when they did a little editing on it, one of the things that they did was they made sure that slavery was protected. And they were not trying to hide the fact that they practiced slavery. I think I did an online count recently, and I'll do it again before I write that Broad Street post. I think slavery as a word comes up 14 times in the Confederate Constitution. Right? It's kind of like there at the margins 2 or 3 times in the U.S. Constitution, other persons and things like that.
It's not in the.
Yeah, slavery doesn't exist in the Constitution, right? But they have to talk about slavery, and they do it a couple times with these passing references to other persons. The Confederate founders were fine with talking about slavery, right? They were going to put it out there, and they did it 14 times. And one of the other things that was interesting about the Confederate Constitution is it was a point in time where the Democrats could essentially eradicate the basis for the second party system reemerging. So the Democrats had a majority in the Confederate Constitutional Convention, and they use it to prohibit protective tariffs and to prohibit federal funding for internal improvements. Right, 2 of the main pillars of the American system, Henry Kay's American system, which really was a critical fissure in the second party system. There's also no national bank, but they never actually do anything in the Confederate Constitution about that, the Confederate Constitutional Convention.
So, I actually wanted to think about what you said, like where the book that you would write, because I think we all have the books that we will write. Somehow we can multiply our times, our day by three or 4 moments. And one of the things that has always struck me, and I just sort of think it's fascinating, is I guess I have to double check, is the 37th Congress, right? So it's the Congress where the Southern Democrats are out, right? And it's an extraordinarily productive Congress, right? I mean, this is where we get the Homestead Act, we get the Moral Land Grant Act, we get all these things that kind of are the pillars of the modern American state. And it comes about because the Southern Democrats aren't there,
yep.
Which is like, wow, that's really interesting. It's to think about, the Southern Democrats as being fundamentally anti-American state development, right? Or they're in their own sort of particular path of state development, but not the sort of American system path of state development. But the complication, though, of this kind of extraordinary productiveness is that a lot of it rests on these land grants, i.e. the dispossession and also genocide of Native people. So it's this kind of odd thing that even as the sort of American state kind of emerge out of its sort of molting, into this sort of new modern entity, it's resting upon dispossession, and it's also resting upon explicit exclusion, right? The Homestead Act says, oh, no, not to Black people, right? Land doesn't go to them.
Right.
state universities, no, like it's not until later that we actually get these sort of provisions that actually allow for the creations of the state HBCUs. And so I think that that's the interesting thing to think about not just geography, but sectionalism, and not only this sort of enduring South, which I don't think the South really ever gets kind of finally incorporated into the US until maybe the New Deal, maybe later. And so that sort of, that the sort of, I'm blanking on his name, big thick book, Mickey, Rob's book, right? That it's not just a book about the South, in this particular moment of the sort of post-Civil War movement. It's a story about the South from essentially the country's founding until pretty much the Civil Rights Movement, and now maybe even that. So I think that's an interesting story. But then I think also the other story is that that the wandering attention of Northern opinion in terms of supporting civil rights for Blacks is in some ways also contingent on their support for immigration, their support for Native peoples. I mean, so it's not only that we get the Homestead Act, we actually get the Anti-Coolie Act as well, right? And so that support for Blacks was always kind of tempered by the support for other things. And once support for immigration goes down, support for at least adhering to treaties that we wrote with Native peoples, once that sort of goes, everything kind of goes. So I just kind of wanted to say that I think that bringing in empire, or bringing in sort of a Paul Freimer kind of approach, might be super useful in thinking through these kind of contradictions.
I had a question actually for Kim about on the Trump point, I was thinking about this in the issue, there's about the second one, where we begin, where we end. I think I saw before the panel, I was looking, did you give a talk that was about like, are we in a new redemption era? Or there's something like, was it, maybe you gave a talk or did a paper on so I'm curious if you think that that Trump is I thought about the 70s and 80s as the kind of redemption after the second Reconstruction. So you get the Reconstruction of the 40s through the 60s, and then you get Nixon and Reagan as the kind of redemption, and then you get the new kind of status quo in the Clinton crime welfare reform story, about this being the like sort of new it doesn't work out perfectly, obviously, but the Republican Party of the 1905 to 1915 period is the Democratic Party of the 1988 to 2000 period. So I'm curious if you think we are in the redemption portion now, or if Black Lives Matter and some of the other stuff going on now is an indication that we have moved past that, or moving into something different, or if Trump is an indication of the move to the kind of like neo-redemption period.
That's a good question. I think that when Trump was first elected, I actually did write something like immediately about that. And then I think I had a piece in the Monkey Cage after the January 6th insurrection, because I was just like, oh, wow, this is kind of scary. And then even thinking about the language that Ted Cruz and others were using to sort of overturn the election. Like, it was literally like they just sort of opened up a book and said, oh, that's great language. Let's use that. But I mean, I think it kind of goes to, I think, the interesting kind of question that Ruth raised about periodization. And I think we have this way of that. You're right when you said that we have a way of that sort of racial politics kind of falls in these very kind of discrete moments. And so it actually is very easy to talk about periods. And I think particularly the moment like when Reagan kind of, the Reagan administration with its very sort of clear racial cues and then policy consequences, that appears to be the end of this kind of Reconstruction moment of the 1960s and 70s. But, is that, so I think in many ways that does make this, maybe doesn't make Reagan redemption, but something else. I mean, I'm actually trying to think about the way that you guys periodize it. And so that maybe this would be period 3, that the Reagan era would be like sort of period 3, like it's a little bit past Reconstruction, but it's not full-blown redemption. And so I think this, I mean, I think in many ways this was like an attempt, whether or not it'll be successful at full-blown redemption, I think is certainly clear. I mean, I think it's pretty explicit that it's about race, it's about voting, it's about, I mean, you have Tucker Carlson talking about replacement theory. I mean, it really is just like, it's kind of there.
I mean, I think too, the interesting thing, like what Jeff was saying about movement west, the Republican Party's position on civil rights at this, I mean, something that Jeff and I talked about too, is like, how does immigration work into any discussion of civil rights? And how do you incorporate just the discussion of immigration into that conversation? And the Republican Party's position on immigration in the late 19th century is also like, you know, the Plessy story is that like the dissenting opinion in Plessy is the one that says like, we grant Black people civil rights, or we should be not allowing segregation because it's a badge of servitude, but there's no way we can incorporate Chinese people into the United States. And so there's a deeply anti-immigrant attitude among Republicans among the same people who are advocating Black civil rights. So I mean, I think that this is just to get to Jeff's point. This period is just so confusing.
Well, it's anti-Asian, it's anti-Latino.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about, I mean, I think this is the point I was trying to think about sectionalism, is that these Western states were brought in the 1850s to sort of solve a problem, but then they come back later to actually make the problem worse, because they're like, oh, no, not only are we not sort of interested in civil rights, but we're interested in tariff policy or whatever, silver. And also, by the way, we don't like Asians and Latinos. So, it's kind of this long, I think, unintended consequence of these earlier political compromises.
Yeah, that's in part the story behind Heather Cock Richardson's new book, right? Essentially how the South eventually wins. It's because of the West. Anybody have any last thoughts about anything?
Thank you all.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same thoughts, right? That this was really great. I appreciate everyone reading this book that's still in PDF form, unfortunately for you guys, right? And we did make a few changes to the uncorrected proofs that you had to read, but it is what it is. But I'm glad that people really engaged with it, and you've given me more thoughts about papers or books to write in your comments, right? And there's only so much of me to go around, but luckily I have co-authors, right? So, but really, thanks very much to everyone. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. And I have recorded this, so you might see yourself pop up in snippets from the Bedrosian Center, perhaps, or something like that. And if anybody wants a copy, just let me know. It said I could save to my computer, so I'll have to find it after I leave here. So thanks everyone.
Thank you all again.